The silent brotherhood, medieval monks between faith and shadow. Good evening, dear travelers through time. Welcome to Dark Medieval, Whispers from the Past, where we walk together through the shadows of history, discovering the human hearts that beat beneath the weight of centuries. Tonight, we journey into the hushed world of medieval monasteries, those islands of prayer and labor set apart from the rushing world, where men in rough woolen robes devoted their lives to God and wrestled with doubt in the silent hours between prayers. This is the Silent Brotherhood, medieval monks between faith and shadow, and I invite you now to settle into comfort, to dim the lights, to let the present world fade as we step through time's veil into a place of stone and candlelight, of whispered Latin and ringing bells, of profound devotion and very human struggle. Whether you are seeking sleep's gentle embrace, a companion for your long journey through the night, or simply a moment of peace away from the noise of modern life, let this story carry you. Close your eyes if you wish. Breathe deeply. Let us begin. Part 1. The Call and the Cloister. The road to the monastery wound through dark forest and across windswept moor, a narrow track of mud and stone that few travelers followed willingly. Those who did come this way carried burdens of a particular kind, not goods for market or messages for lords, but something heavier and less visible. They came carrying souls in turmoil, seeking refuge from a world grown too loud or too painful or too empty. They came seeking meaning in ritual, salvation through sacrifice, peace through prayer. They came to give their lives away. Brother Thomas remembered his own journey up that lonely road, remembered it as clearly as if it had been yesterday rather than 30 years past. He had been young then, barely 16 summers, with his mother's tears still wet on his cheek and his father's blessing ringing hollow in his ears. He had walked away from the only life he knew, from the workshop where he had learned the carpenter's trade, from the girl who had smiled at him at market day, from the warm chaos of family and the promise of ordinary happiness. He had walked away because something inside him had broken when his youngest sister died of fever, when he had held her small hand and felt it grow cold despite his prayers, despite his desperate bargaining with God. If the world held such senseless suffering, he had thought, then perhaps there was something beyond the world worth seeking. The monastery had stood before him that first evening like a fortress of faith, its high walls of gray stone rising against the darkening sky, its bell tower catching the last rays of sun while the valley below sank into shadow. The gate had opened at his knock, creaking on iron hinges, and a monk with a face like weathered wood had looked him over with eyes that saw too much. No words of welcome, only a nod, and Thomas had stepped across the threshold into another life entirely. The rule of Saint Benedict governed everything within those walls, a framework of prayer and work that divided each day into measured portions as precise as the marks on a sundial. The brothers rose in darkness for matins, stumbling from their narrow beds in the cold dormitory, their breath misting in the chill air as they fumbled for robes and sandals. Down the night-black corridors they walked in silence, past walls where moisture gleamed like tears, past tiny windows that showed only more darkness beyond. Into the chapel they filed, taking their places in choir stalls worn smooth by generations of monks before them, and there they sang the ancient psalms while sleep still clung to their voices and their bodies ached for rest. This was the first of 7 times each day they would gather for prayer, the hours that marked the passage of time more surely than any clock. After matins came prime at dawn, then terce mid-morning, sext at noon, none in the afternoon, vespers as evening fell, and compline before bed. Between these fixed points of devotion lay the work, the copying of manuscripts in the scriptorium, the tending of gardens and livestock, the maintenance of buildings forever threatening to crumble back to earth, the care of the sick and poor who sometimes appeared at the gates seeking charity. Every task was prayer, they were taught. Every action an offering to God. Brother Thomas had learned this rhythm slowly, his body and mind resisting at first the unnatural demands of midnight prayer and constant silence. The vow of silence had been hardest at the beginning. He who had been accustomed to easy conversation, to jokes shared with fellow apprentices, to singing as he worked. Here words were rationed like bread in famine, permitted only when necessary for work or during the brief recreation period after supper. Even then, conversation was to be edifying, focused on spiritual matters, devoid of gossip or levity. Laughter was suspect. Silence was the monastery's native tongue. In that silence, strange things happened to the mind. Thoughts grew louder, circling endlessly like birds unable to find a place to land. Memories became vivid, more real sometimes than the present moment. The past came alive in ways it never had when life was filled with chatter and distraction. Thomas found himself remembering conversations from years before, hearing his sister's voice clear as a bell, seeing his mother's face as she kneaded bread, feeling the grain of wood beneath his carpenter's plane. These memories were both comfort and torment, gifts and temptations pulling him back toward the world he had renounced. The monastery itself was a world complete, requiring almost nothing from beyond its walls. The brothers grew their own food in gardens laid out with geometric precision, each bed of herbs or vegetables tended with the same care they brought to prayer. They kept bees for honey and wax, sheep for wool, chickens for eggs. They had a mill for grinding grain, a bakehouse for bread, a brewery for the weak ale that was safer to drink than water. They had workshops where skilled brothers practiced crafts, carpentry and masonry, weaving and leatherworking, the binding of books. Everything was simple, functional, made to last. Beauty was found not in ornament, but in proportion, in honest materials honestly used, in the rightness of form following function. The scriptorium was where Brother Thomas had found his calling within the calling. After years of general labor, mucking out stables, harvesting vegetables, hauling stone, he had been assigned to assist the scribes who copied manuscripts. His carpenter's hands, trained to precision and patience, proved suited to the delicate work of preparing parchment, mixing inks, ruling lines. Eventually, he was allowed to copy text himself, beginning with simple prayers and progressing over years to entire books of scripture. The work demanded absolute concentration. A single error could ruin a page that had taken days to prepare. The cold made fingers stiff and clumsy. The light was always inadequate despite the carefully positioned candles and oil lamps. His back ached from bending over the writing desk. His eyes burned from the strain of reading faded exemplars and forming perfect letters. Yet there was something in this work that fed his soul in ways that prayer sometimes did not. When he was copying, the chattering of his mind would cease. The doubts that plagued him would fall silent. There was only the scratch of quill on parchment, the slow emergence of words from blank page, the satisfaction of a line well executed, a letter perfectly formed. He was not thinking about God in those moments, not consciously praying, yet he felt closer to the divine than when he was kneeling in chapel mouthing familiar psalms. The irony did not escape him. Perhaps this too was a kind of doubt, or perhaps it was simply the truth of how grace worked, not always through the channels we expected. The monastery held 30 brothers in Thomas's time, ranging from novices barely out of boyhood to ancient men who could no longer work but sat in corners murmuring prayers and staring at visions visible only to them. Each man had his own story of how he came to be there, though these stories were rarely told. Some had genuinely felt a calling to religious life, a conviction that God wanted them here. Others had been given to the monastery as children by parents too poor to feed them, growing up knowing no other life. Some were younger sons of nobles, sent to the church because inheritance laws left them no other prospects. Others were refugees from the world's sorrows, men widowed, men who had loved unwisely, men who had committed sins they could not live with, men who simply could not find their place in ordinary life and hoped that extraordinary devotion might make them whole. Brother Anselm, who supervised the scriptorium, had been a scholar at the university before taking vows. He spoke Latin like a native tongue, knew Greek and even some Hebrew, could discuss philosophy and theology with a precision that left others bewildered. Yet something had broken in him during his studies. Thomas never learned what exactly, and he had fled the world of ideas for the supposed simplicity of monastic life. He was not a happy man, Thomas thought, watching him sometimes during prayers, seeing how his mouth tightened and his eyes closed not in devotion, but as if shutting out pain. Anselm drove himself ruthlessly in his work, copying text with a speed and accuracy that seemed almost inhuman, rising from his desk only when the bell rang for the next office. He slept little, ate less, and when he thought no one was watching, his face took on an expression of such desolation that Thomas had to look away. Brother Martin, who tended the infirmary, had a gentleness that seemed to radiate from him like warmth from a fire. He was the one the brothers went to when they were sick in body or soul, when they needed someone who would listen without judgment, who would offer comfort without empty platitudes. He knew herbs and their properties, could set bones and lance infections, could ease pain when nothing could cure disease. He had lost his wife and children to plague, Thomas had learned, lost them all in the space of a week while he was away on business. He had returned to find his house marked with the cross, his family buried in a mass grave, his life turned to ash. What else was there to do but give what remained to God? Brother Paulus was old beyond reckoning, so ancient that no one remembered when he had arrived or where he had come from. He had outlived several abbots, had seen the monastery rebuilt after fire, had copied manuscripts that were now themselves ancient. His hands shook too badly now to write. His eyes could barely focus, but still he shuffled to chapel for every office. Still he murmured prayers in a voice like wind through dry leaves. Sometimes he would grab a younger brother's arm and speak urgently of visions, angels descending, demons lurking, the Virgin Mary appearing in the garden. Whether these were genuine spiritual experiences or the wanderings of an aged mind, no one could say. The brothers treated him with reverence, but also with the gentle firmness one might use with a child, guiding him back to his place, making sure he did not wander off and hurt himself. The abbot, Father Benedict, carried the weight of leadership with visible weariness. He was responsible not just for the spiritual welfare of his monks, but for the monastery's survival in a world that could be hostile to religious communities. There were lands to be managed, rents to be collected, disputes with neighbors to be resolved, relations with the local lord to be maintained. He had to discipline brothers who broke rules, comfort those in spiritual crisis, make decisions about admitting novices or expelling those who proved unsuitable. He had to balance accounts, plan for lean years, negotiate with merchants and craftsmen. The rules said the abbot should be a father to his monks, and Father Benedict took this seriously, but the role clearly exhausted him. He was not yet 50 but looked older, his face lined with worry, his shoulders bent as if under physical burden. The monastery's relationship with the outside world was complex and carefully managed. The brothers were supposed to be dead to the world, their focus entirely on heaven, yet they could not survive without the world's support. Noble patrons provided endowments expecting prayers for their souls and those of their ancestors. Peasants from nearby villages brought produce to sell at the monastery gate and sometimes sought help in times of crisis. Travelers occasionally appeared seeking shelter for a night, and hospitality was a sacred duty. Pilgrims stopped on their way to distant shrines, hoping for blessings or miracles. Sometimes criminals arrived seeking sanctuary, and the ancient laws of the church protected them within the monastery walls for a certain period, creating tension between justice and mercy. Inside the walls, life proceeded in its careful rhythm, each day like the one before, each season turning in its appointed time. Winter was the hardest. The cold seeped through stone walls despite careful banking of fires, transforming the monastery into a place of perpetual chill where breath misted and fingers grew numb and the elderly brothers coughed through the night. The chapel was especially brutal in winter, an ice house where prayer became an act of physical endurance. The brothers would huddle in their robes, tucking hands into sleeves, stamping feet when they stood, trying to sing psalms through chattering teeth. Morning prayer in winter darkness was a particular torment, dragging yourself from the small warmth of your bed into air so cold it hurt to breathe, stumbling through blackness toward a chapel only slightly less dark, kneeling on stone that drew heat from your body like a vampire drawing blood. Spring brought relief and renewal, the gardens coming back to life, the first herbs and vegetables appearing, the fruit trees blooming in the orchard. There was joy in this greening, a sense that the world affirmed goodness, that God had not abandoned his creation. The brothers worked in the gardens with something like happiness, planting and weeding and watching things grow. Even the most austere among them could not help but smile at the first strawberries, the first peas, the first lettuces. It was harder to doubt in spring, easier to believe that suffering served some purpose, that death was not the end. Summer meant long days of labor under hot sun, harvesting hay, tending livestock, making repairs to buildings weathered by winter storms. The light lasted so long that it disrupted the careful rhythm of prayer, making midnight matins less a journey into darkness than a brief interruption of twilight. Some brothers struggled with summer's abundance, felt it as a temptation away from proper austerity. Others simply enjoyed the warmth after winter's cruelty, the chance to work without freezing, the plenty of fresh food after months of dried and salted provisions. Autumn was beautiful and melancholy in equal measure, the trees turning gold and crimson, the harvest filling storerooms, the slant of light growing lower and sadder. There was much work to be done preparing for winter, preserving food, cutting firewood, making repairs, checking that roofs were sound and walls weatherproof. The brothers could feel time's passage more acutely in autumn, could sense the wheel turning toward darkness and cold. The older ones grew thoughtful, perhaps wondering if this would be their last autumn, if they would survive another winter. The younger ones sometimes felt autumn's beauty as a reproach, reminding them of things they had given up, of experiences they would never have. Through all seasons, through all weathers, the rhythm of prayer continued unbroken. This was the heart of monastic life, the reason the monastery existed. 7 times a day the bell rang and the brothers gathered, and 7 times a day they offered the psalms and prayers that were the church's work, the Opus Dei. This was not prayer as the ordinary Christian might experience it, brief, occasional, spontaneous. This was prayer as vocation, prayer as labor, prayer as the organizing principle of existence. The same psalms cycled through week after week, year after year, decade after decade, until the words were smooth as river stones, until they could be recited without thought, until they became simply the medium in which the brothers lived, like fish in water. Did such prayer work? Did it reach the God to whom it was addressed? Did it change anything, accomplish anything, mean anything at all? These were the questions that haunted Brother Thomas in his 30th year of monastic life. Questions he could not ask aloud, could barely acknowledge to himself. He had given his life to this. He had sacrificed youth, possibility, love, family, everything ordinary humans held dear. He had made himself into something strange and marginal, a man without a place in the world. And for what? For prayer that might be nothing more than words spoken into emptiness, for devotion to a God who gave no clear sign of his existence, for a salvation that might be nothing but wishful thinking, desperate fantasy, elaborate self-deception. These doubts came most strongly at night, in the darkness between Compline and Matins. When he lay on his narrow bed staring at the ceiling, he could not see, listening to the sounds of 30 men sleeping, snores and coughs and muttered dream words, the rustling of straw mattresses, the creaking of wood. In those hours he felt the full weight of his choices, the immensity of what he had given away, the impossibility of ever going back. He was 50 now, too old to start over, too formed by monastic life to fit anywhere else. Even if he were to leave, and leaving was possible, technically, though shameful and rare, where would he go? What would he do? He had no family remaining, no trade anymore, no place in the world. The monastery was his only home, these silent men his only family, this life of prayer and doubt the only life he had. Part 2. The Weight of Devotion. The scriptorium in winter morning was a place of peculiar suffering. Brother Thomas sat at his desk with hands so cold he could barely hold the quill, his breath misting before him, his shoulders hunched against the chill that seemed to emanate from the very stones. Before him lay a sheet of parchment, carefully prepared, expensive, irreplaceable. He was copying the Gospel of John, a sacred text that demanded absolute accuracy, every letter perfect, every word a prayer. But his mind wandered despite his efforts, drifting like snow outside the narrow window, settling on memories and regrets and questions he could not answer. Brother Anselm sat at the desk across from him, his quill moving with mechanical precision, his face a mask of concentration. He had been copying since before dawn with only brief breaks for prayer, and he would continue until the light failed or the bell rang for the next office. Thomas sometimes wondered if Anselm actually read what he copied or if the words simply flowed through him without leaving any impression, like water through a pipe. Could you copy scripture for years without it transforming you? Could you handle holy words daily and remain unholy? The evidence suggested yes. Anselm was brilliant and disciplined, and utterly miserable, a man who had mastered the external forms of devotion while remaining internally a wasteland. The work of copying was itself a kind of spiritual practice, or so they were taught. Each letter formed with care was an act of worship. Each word accurately rendered was a service to God and the Church. The manuscripts they created would carry scripture and theology to other monasteries, would be studied by generations unborn, would help preserve Christian civilization against the chaos that always threatened to overwhelm it. This was important work, holy work, work that mattered beyond their individual lives. Thomas tried to believe this. Most days he succeeded. But on cold mornings when his fingers ached and his eyes blurred and his mind filled with doubts like smoke, belief became harder to sustain. The parchment before him had been made from the skin of a calf, young, tender, carefully prepared. The animal had died so that scripture might be preserved, so that the gospel could be copied and passed on. Was this a sacred sacrifice or merely practical? Did God care about such things? Did the calf's brief life have meaning beyond providing material for monks to write on? Thomas had watched the parchment maker at work once, had seen the skin soaked and scraped and stretched, had smelled the lime and the decay, had witnessed the transformation of dead animal into writing surface. It was like transubstantiation, he had thought at the time, something base becoming something elevated through ritual and intention. But maybe it was nothing like that. Maybe it was just craftwork, technical skill, the turning of resources into products that humans found useful. He dipped his quill and began to write. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The letters formed slowly, carefully, each one a small work of art. He had copied this verse before, many times, knew it by heart in Latin and in the vernacular. In principio erat verbum. In the beginning was the Word. But what did it mean, really? Was it poetry, metaphor, mystical philosophy? Or was it claiming to be literal truth, that before creation, before time, there was somehow language, speech, meaning? How could there be words before there was anything to name? The Church Fathers had written volumes trying to explain such verses, building elaborate theological structures on foundations of paradox and mystery. Thomas had read some of these commentaries in his years in the monastery, had even copied some of them. They were impressive in their way, these great towers of reasoning. But did they actually explain anything? Or did they simply obscure the fundamental strangeness of the claims, cover confusion with complicated language? Brother Martin entered the scriptorium carrying a tray with cups of watered wine and hunks of bread, a mid-morning meal permitted because of the cold. He moved quietly, as everything in the monastery was done quietly, setting the tray on a side table and nodding to the scribes. Thomas was grateful for the interruption, an excuse to rest his cramped hand and frozen fingers. He stood, joints creaking, and walked to the table where Martin stood watching him with concerned eyes. "You look tired, brother," Martin said quietly, keeping his voice low so as not to disturb Anselm, who had not even looked up at the arrival of food. "I am always tired," Thomas replied, attempting a smile. "I have been tired for 30 years. It is more than that, I think." Martin's gift was seeing beneath surfaces, reading the signs of suffering that others missed. "Your soul is tired." Thomas took a cup of wine and drank, feeling the slight warmth spread through his chest. Was his soul tired? Yes. Yes, it was. Exhausted beyond measure, worn out by decades of discipline, by the endless cycle of prayer, by the weight of doubt carried alone and silent. But he could not say this, not even to kind Martin. To admit such weariness was to admit that the monastic life might be too much, that human beings might not be designed for such relentless renunciation, that perhaps God asked too much of those who try to serve him completely. "I am well enough," he said instead. "The winter is long. We will all feel better when spring comes." Martin looked at him a moment longer, unconvinced, then nodded and returned to his rounds. He would visit the other brothers, checking on health and spirits, offering what comfort he could. Some of the monks avoided him, uncomfortable with his insight, not wanting to be seen so clearly. Thomas did not avoid him, but neither did he open himself fully. What would be the point? Martin could not change anything. He could offer sympathy, but not solution. The doubts Thomas carried could not be cured with herbs or kind words. Back at his desk, Thomas tried to pray before resuming work. This was recommended, to center oneself in God's presence, to remember why the work mattered, to offer the labor as sacrifice. He closed his eyes and attempted to feel something, to touch whatever it was that others called God's presence. But there was only the cold and the silence and the awareness of his own breathing. He waited, hoping. Nothing came. The emptiness inside him matched the emptiness of the winter sky outside. He was alone in his own head, talking to himself, pretending that someone else was listening. He opened his eyes and picked up his quill. The work continued regardless of faith or doubt, regardless of presence or absence, regardless of anything internal. The letters formed, the words accumulated, the page filled slowly with scripture. From outside perspective, there was no way to tell the difference between a monk copying scripture in fervent faith and one copying in hollow doubt. The product was the same. Perhaps that was the point. Perhaps what mattered was not the state of one's soul, but simply the completion of the work, the faithful performance of duty regardless of feeling. Perhaps God, if he existed, cared more about obedience than emotion, more about action than authenticity. The afternoon brought a visitor to the monastery, a rare event in winter when travel was difficult and dangerous. Brother Porter came to the scriptorium to inform the abbot, who had been consulting with Brother Anselm about manuscript purchases. Thomas could hear their low voices in the corridor outside, the porter explaining that a noble lady had arrived seeking audience, that she was greatly distressed, that she wished to endow prayers for her son who had been killed in battle. The abbot's reply was indistinct, but soon Thomas heard footsteps moving away toward the guest hall where the lady would be received. Such visitors brought the world into the monastery, carrying with them the smells and sounds and sorrows of life beyond the walls. This lady would be wealthy. Only the wealthy could afford to endow significant prayers, but money did not protect against grief. Her son was dead, killed in one of the endless wars that plagued the land. Wars fought for reasons most people could not explain, producing nothing but corpses and suffering. She wanted prayers for his soul, wanted masses said, wanted to purchase through the church whatever chance existed that he might be saved despite dying in violence. Did it work? Would the monk's prayers alter her son's eternal fate? The church said yes, taught that prayers and masses could reduce time in purgatory, could help souls progress toward heaven. But how did that work exactly? Did God keep accounts, tallying prayers like coins, letting souls advance based on accumulated intercession? It seemed crude, transactional, more like commerce than divine justice. Yet who was Thomas to judge? The lady had lost her son. If prayer offered comfort, if the ritual of endowing masses gave her something to do with her grief, something to hope for, then perhaps that was enough. Perhaps the value of prayer was not in changing God's mind, but in helping humans endure unbearable things. Perhaps the whole elaborate structure of the church, the monasteries and masses, the saints and relics, the rituals and penances, existed not because it was literally true, but because it was psychologically necessary, a framework for managing the terror of existence, the horror of death, the pain of loss. But if that was all it was, psychological comfort, elaborate coping mechanism, then what had Thomas given his life for? He had not joined the monastery seeking comfort, but seeking truth, seeking God himself, seeking transformation into something better than the confused and suffering creature he had been. If the monastery was simply a refuge for the wounded, a place to hide from life's difficulties, then he had wasted 30 years. He could have found comfort elsewhere, could have married and had children and built a life in the world. Instead, he had chosen this narrow, cold, endlessly repetitive existence, had embraced poverty and celibacy and obedience, had tried to empty himself so that God might fill him. And what had he received in return? Silence, absence, the same doubts he had carried when he arrived, only deeper now, more confirmed by years of experience. The bell rang for Vespers, the evening prayer, and Thomas set down his quill with relief. His day's work was done, several pages of gospel copied without significant error. Tomorrow he would continue, and the day after that, and for all the days that remained to him. This was his life, this patient accumulation of letters and words, this slow progress through sacred texts he did not truly believe in, this performance of devotion to a God who might not exist. He stood and stretched, feeling the protest of muscles held too long in one position, then joined the other brothers filing toward the chapel. The chapel in evening was less brutal than at midnight, though still cold enough to make endurance an effort. The light from candles and lamps created pockets of warmth and visibility in the general darkness, made the space feel both intimate and vast, both sheltering and empty. The brothers took their places in the choir stalls, arranging robes and settling into position. Thomas's place was among the elder monks, those who had been in the community for decades. To his left was Brother Paulus, ancient and murmuring. To his right was Brother Gerard, who had gone almost completely blind but still attended every office, still sang the Psalms from memory, his voice cracked but persistent. The abbot intoned the opening prayer and the brothers responded, their voices blending in the familiar patterns, the ancient cadences. The psalms for Vespers flowed over them, around them, through them, words about God's greatness, about human smallness, about trust and fear and hope and despair. Thomas sang without thinking, his mouth forming words his mind no longer registered. He had sung these same psalms thousands of times. They had lost their power to move him, had become simply sounds, patterns, the acoustic wallpaper of his life. Yet he continued singing because this was what monks did, because the rule demanded it, because stopping would mean confronting the emptiness too directly. After Vespers came supper, the one full meal of the day, eaten in the refectory while one of the brothers read aloud from Scripture or the lives of saints. Tonight it was Brother James reading, a young monk who stumbled over the Latin, mispronouncing words, losing his place. The abbot did not correct him. Patience with novices was part of the rule, but Thomas could see Anselm wince at each error, could feel the scholar's irritation like heat radiating across the room. The meal itself was simple: thick soup of vegetables and barley, coarse bread, the eternal weak ale. No meat except on feast days, no rich foods, nothing to excite the senses or disturb the spirit. It was enough to sustain life, but no more, fuel for bodies that were merely vehicles for souls. Thomas ate slowly, trying to be mindful as they were taught, trying to taste each bite, to be present to the gift of food. But his mind wandered as always, drifting to memories of meals shared in his father's house decades ago, meals where there had been laughter and conversation, where his mother's cooking had been a kind of love, where food was more than fuel. He could almost taste his mother's stew, rich with meat and herbs, could almost hear his siblings' voices arguing and joking. That life felt impossibly distant now, as if it had happened to someone else, as if the boy he had been and the man he had become were two different people connected only by memory. After supper came the brief recreation period, when conversation was permitted and the brothers could walk in the cloister or sit by the fire in the warming room. Thomas usually went to the cloister, preferring the cold and silence to the effort of interaction. But tonight, Brother Martin caught his arm and steered him toward the warming room, where a fire had been built against the winter chill. Several brothers sat on benches near the flames, hands extended toward the warmth, faces softened by the firelight. "Sit," Martin said quietly. "You spend too much time alone with your thoughts. It is not healthy." Thomas wanted to argue but complied, taking a seat on the end of a bench. The fire felt good, almost painfully good, after the day's cold. He watched the flames, hypnotic and comforting, while around him the other brothers talked in low voices about mundane matters, whether the roof repair was holding, whether they had sufficient grain to last until spring, whether the bishop might visit this year. Normal, practical conversation, the kind that held communities together, that filled the spaces between prayer with ordinary human connection. Brother William, who managed the monastery's farms, was speaking about a sick cow, debating whether to butcher it now or try to heal it and risk losing the meat if it died. Brother James asked questions about animal husbandry with the earnestness of youth, wanting to understand, wanting to learn. Brother Anselm sat silent in the corner, his face turned away from the firelight, present in body but absent in spirit. The abbot was not there. He would be in his room, dealing with correspondence or accounts, working late into the night as he usually did. "Brother Thomas," William said, turning to him, "you were a carpenter before you came to us. Do you think the barn timbers need replacing or just reinforcing?" Thomas pulled his attention from the fire and considered the question, grateful for something practical to think about. How bad is the rot? If it is only surface damage, reinforcement might suffice. But if the rot goes deep, replacement is safer. A collapsed barn would be worse than the cost of new timbers. William nodded. "That is my thought as well. I will examine them more closely when the weather improves." The conversation moved on to other matters, repairs, supplies, the health of various brothers. Thomas half listened, watching the fire, feeling the warmth slowly penetrate his cold flesh. This was not a bad life, he thought, when considered practically. The work was meaningful in its way. The community provided stability, security, belonging. The rhythm of prayer, however empty it sometimes felt, imposed order on chaos, gave structure to days that might otherwise drift into meaninglessness. Many people in the world beyond these walls lived harder lives, more uncertain, more dangerous, more filled with suffering. Perhaps he should be grateful for what he had rather than mourning what he had given up. But gratitude felt beyond him tonight, as it did most nights. He was hollow, used up, going through motions that had long since lost their significance. He would continue, of course. There was no choice but to continue. He would rise at midnight for matins, would spend his days in the scriptorium copying words he did not believe, would eat his simple meals and attend his offices and sleep in his narrow bed until finally death came and released him from the burden of doubt and devotion both. This was his life. This was all his life would ever be. Part 3: Shadows and Grace. Winter deepened and the monastery drew in on itself like a creature hibernating, the brothers moving through their routines with the slow endurance of those who know spring is distant but must be reached. Brother Thomas marked the passing days by the manuscripts he completed, the pages accumulated, the steady progress through the Gospel of John. He was nearing the end now, approaching the passion narrative, the betrayal and trial and crucifixion. These were the passages that had moved him most when he was younger, when he had first read them with eyes not yet dulled by repetition. The human suffering of Christ, the abandonment and doubt, the terrible question from the cross, "Why have you forsaken me?" had seemed to Thomas then a validation of his own suffering, proof that God understood what it meant to hurt and doubt and feel alone. Now the passages felt different, or perhaps he felt different reading them. The story was so familiar it had become almost abstract, a narrative worn smooth by handling, like a pebble in a stream. He could read the words without feeling their weight, could copy them without being changed by them. This was the danger of the monastic life. He had come to realize that the very practices meant to deepen faith could instead hollow it out through endless repetition. The Psalms became just sounds, the prayers just recitation, the scripture just text. Familiarity bred not contempt exactly, but a kind of numbness, a protective callus that formed over the soul to shield it from the demands of what it was encountering. Brother Anselm had collapsed in the scriptorium during a cold afternoon, simply slumped over his desk without warning, his quill rolling from his hand to leave an ink trail across the parchment he had been copying. Thomas and the other scribes had rushed to him, alarmed, calling for Brother Martin. The infirmarian had come quickly, had examined Anselm with practiced hands, had declared that it was exhaustion and malnutrition. The man had been eating almost nothing, sleeping barely at all, driving himself with an intensity that his body could no longer sustain. They had carried Anselm to the infirmary and laid him on one of the narrow beds there, and Martin had stayed with him, trying to get him to drink broth, to rest, to accept the care being offered. But Anselm had turned his face to the wall and would speak to no one, would barely eat, seemed to have simply given up. Thomas visited him there, sat beside the bed in the dim infirmary with its smell of herbs and sickness, and tried to speak words of comfort that sounded hollow even to himself. "You must rest, brother," Thomas said. "You have been working too hard. Your body needs time to heal." Anselm's voice came flat and empty, addressed to the wall rather than to Thomas. "What is the point? All the copying, all the prayers, all the years of discipline. What has it accomplished? I am not closer to God than when I began. I am emptier. The work fills time, but nothing more." Thomas felt something twist inside him, recognition and fear combined. This was his own doubt spoken aloud by another voice, his own emptiness reflected back at him. He wanted to offer counter-arguments, wanted to defend the life they had both chosen, but the words would not come. What could he say that would be true? That prayer works, that God is real, that their sacrifices matter? He could not lie to a dying man, even a lie that might comfort. "I know," Thomas said quietly. "I feel it too. The emptiness, the doubt. Anselm turned his head slightly, not enough to look at Thomas, but enough to show he was listening. Thomas continued, feeling his way through thoughts he had never spoken before, not to anyone. Perhaps we expected too much. Perhaps transformation does not work the way we thought. We came here seeking God, seeking to be changed, made holy, lifted above our human confusion. But what if that is not possible? What if we remain what we are, confused, doubtful, human, and the only thing that changes is that we learn to accept this, to live with it rather than being destroyed by it? Then we have wasted our lives, Anselm said, his voice breaking slightly, given everything for nothing. Perhaps the waste would have been in the alternative, to live in the world, to pretend we did not carry these questions, to distract ourselves with ordinary life until death came. At least here we have been honest about our doubt, have lived it fully rather than running from it. There is no comfort in that, Anselm said. No, Thomas agreed. There is not. They sat in silence after that. Nothing more to say. The small comfort of shared suffering the only thing passing between them. Brother Martin came eventually and sent Thomas away so Anselm could rest. Thomas returned to the scriptorium but could not work, could not focus on the words before him. He sat at his desk staring at nothing until the bell rang for vespers and he had to leave. Anselm died 3 days later, quietly in the night, his body simply giving up the effort of continuing. They buried him in the monastery cemetery, a small plot behind the chapel where generations of monks lay beneath simple wooden crosses. The funeral was the same as all monastic funerals: prayers for the dead, committal of the body to earth, the reminder that all flesh is grass, that we are dust, and to dust we shall return. The brothers sang the psalms that were always sung, performed the rituals that were always performed. Anselm's death was a loss, but not a tragedy. He had lived long enough, had completed much work, had died in a monastery surrounded by brothers rather than alone in some ditch or dying miserably of plague. By medieval standards, it was a good death. But Thomas could not help thinking that Anselm had died of despair as much as exhaustion, that the emptiness had killed him as surely as any disease. And if it could kill Anselm, brilliant and disciplined Anselm, then what hope was there for the rest of them? How did one continue when faith was gone, when the structures and rituals that were supposed to sustain you felt like chains instead, when every prayer was an exercise in pretending to believe what you did not? The question plagued him through the following weeks, through the slow progression towards spring. He continued his work because there was nothing else to do, but he felt himself becoming like Anselm had been, hollow, driven by nothing but inertia and habit. The manuscript he was copying would be completed not because he cared about it, but simply because stopping felt like too much effort, because finishing was the path of least resistance. This was not devotion. This was not faith. This was just endurance, the dull persistence of organisms that continue functioning long after meaning has fled. One night, unable to sleep after Compline, Thomas left his bed and walked through the dark monastery, past the sleeping dormitory and down the corridors to the chapel. He did not mean to pray. He was beyond prayer, but he needed to be somewhere other than the suffocating darkness of his cell. The chapel was empty, only the eternal lamp burning before the altar, its small flame insufficient to dispel the shadows. Thomas stood in the darkness, looking toward where the crucifix hung above the altar, seeing only its dim outline. If God existed, he thought, if Christ was real, if any of it was true, then surely God knew what Thomas was feeling, knew the doubt, the emptiness, the despair, knew that Thomas had tried, had given 30 years of his life to prayer and discipline and sacrifice, and had received nothing in return but silence. If God existed and if God cared, then surely this was the moment for some sign, some indication that the faith Thomas had lost might be worth finding again. He waited in the darkness. The silence continued. No voice spoke, no presence manifested, no comfort came. There was only the guttering flame of the lamp and the cold pressing in from the stone walls and the awareness of his own breathing in the empty space. He was alone. He had always been alone. All the prayers of 30 years had been words spoken into void. All the rituals, empty performances. All the devotion, a kind of self-deception that he could no longer sustain. But then, standing there in the darkness, something shifted. Not presence replacing absence. Not faith returning. Not any of the things he had been hoping for. Instead, a kind of acceptance, cold and clear. This was the reality. The emptiness was not going to be filled. The doubt was not going to be resolved. The questions had no answers. And yet, here he stood. Here he continued to stand. Despite everything, despite the absence of God or meaning or purpose, despite the waste of 30 years and the certainty that all his remaining years would be equally wasted, still he stood. Still he would rise tomorrow for matins. Still he would go to the scriptorium and copy scripture. Still he would attend the offices and eat the simple meals and live the narrow life he had chosen. Was this faith? If so, it was faith of a strange kind. Faith without consolation or certainty. Faith that was almost indistinguishable from stubbornness or habit or inability to imagine an alternative. Perhaps that was enough. Perhaps this bare, minimal persistence in the face of absence was the only kind of faith possible for humans, the only honest response to a universe that offered no clear answers. The great saints with their visions and ecstasies, the mystics with their experiences of divine union. Perhaps they had been lying or deluded or simply wired differently. For most people, for ordinary struggling humans like Thomas, there was only this, the choice to continue or not, in the absence of any good reason to do either. He left the chapel and returned to his bed. The next morning, he rose at the bell for matins and went to prayer with the other brothers. He sang the psalms he had sung 10,000 times before. He copied scripture in the scriptorium, his hand moving across the parchment in the familiar motions, forming letters and words that accumulated into meaning he did not have to believe in. He ate his meals and worked in the garden when spring finally came, watching the earth come alive again, the stubborn persistence of seeds pushing through soil toward light. Spring brought Brother James to him one afternoon in the garden, the young monk troubled and seeking counsel. Thomas wanted to refuse. Who was he to offer guidance when his own faith was gone? But James looked so desperate, so lost, that Thomas could not turn him away. They walked together along the garden paths between rows of new growth, and James spoke haltingly about his doubts, his sense that God was absent, his fear that he had made a terrible mistake in taking vows. "I pray and pray," James said, his young face twisted with distress, "but I feel nothing. No presence, no peace, no certainty. I see the older brothers so serene in their devotion, and I wonder what is wrong with me that I cannot feel what they feel." Thomas almost laughed, bitter and sad. The older brothers serene? If only James knew how many of them carried the same doubts, the same emptiness, hiding it behind masks of piety and routine. But he could not say this to James, could not destroy whatever faith the young man still possessed. The absence you feel, Thomas said carefully, is not a sign that God has abandoned you or that you have failed. It is simply part of the experience of faith. Prayer is not always consolation. Often it is simply persistence, the choice to continue showing up despite the silence. But what if there is no God? James asked, his voice dropping to a whisper as if speaking heresy. What if all of this, the prayers, the sacrifice, the discipline, what if it is all for nothing? Thomas stopped walking and looked at the young monk, seeing himself 3 decades earlier, seeing the same confusion and fear. He could lie. He could offer the reassurances that monks were supposed to offer, could speak about faith and trust and the importance of perseverance. But James deserved honesty, even if honesty was harder than comfort. I do not know, Thomas said. I have been a monk for 30 years, and I still do not know. Perhaps there is God. Perhaps there is not. Perhaps the truth is somewhere between, something more complex than either belief or unbelief allows. But I know this. The life we have chosen, difficult as it is, has made us ask questions that most people never ask, has forced us to confront the emptiness at the heart of existence, has prevented us from distracting ourselves with the 1,000 small comforts and pleasures that let others avoid thinking about what their lives mean. That is worth something, even if we never find the answers we seek. James looked unconvinced, still troubled, but also slightly relieved, as if the permission to doubt was itself a kind of comfort. They walked together in silence after that, and Thomas felt something unexpected, a sense that perhaps his own struggle had not been entirely wasted if it allowed him to offer James this small gift of honest company in doubt. The years continued their slow procession. Thomas grew older, his hair gray, his joints stiff, his eyes weakening so that copying became ever more difficult. Brother Martin grew old as well, finally too frail to manage the infirmary, passing his duties to a younger monk. Father Benedict died and a new abbot was elected, a former prior from another monastery, a man Thomas did not know well. The world beyond the monastery walls changed in ways the brothers heard about only dimly. Wars and rumors of wars, plagues and famines, the rise and fall of kingdoms. Inside the walls, little changed. The rhythm of prayer continued. The cycle of seasons turned. The work went on. Thomas finished the Gospel of John and began another manuscript, and then another. His life measured in completed books, in thousands of pages of text copied letter by letter, word by word. It was a slow kind of immortality, his work outlasting him, carrying forward into a future he would never see. The manuscripts he created would be read by people not yet born, would preserve knowledge in Scripture and the accumulated wisdom of the Church. Was this enough to give his life meaning? He did not know, but it was what he had, and so he continued. One spring morning, working in the garden planting beans, Thomas felt something release inside him, some knot of tension he had carried for so long he had forgotten it was there. The absence of God had not changed. He still prayed into silence, still performed rituals that felt empty, still doubted everything the church taught. But somehow it no longer mattered in the way it once had. He had made his peace with the emptiness, had learned to live in it rather than fighting against it. The monastic life had not given him what he had sought when he arrived as a confused and suffering young man. It had not brought him to God or transformed him into something holy or resolved his doubts. But it had given him structure and purpose and a way to spend his years that was at least attempting something difficult and honest. Perhaps that was enough. The other brothers noticed the change in him, though they could not have said what exactly had changed. He seemed lighter somehow, more present, more capable of offering comfort to those who struggled. Young monks began seeking him out, asking his counsel, and he found he could speak to them honestly about doubt without destroying their faith, could acknowledge the difficulty of the monastic path while affirming that it was still worth walking. He became, without intending to, a kind of elder, a person others turned to in their darkness. Brother Martin, ancient now and failing, told him once, "You have finally become what you were meant to be, not a saint, not a mystic, but a human being who has learned to live honestly with the mysteries, and who can help others do the same." Thomas did not know if this was true, but he accepted it as a kind of blessing, the best he was likely to receive. When Martin died, quietly in sleep, peacefully, his long life completed, Thomas mourned him genuinely, missing his kindness and insight, grateful for his friendship across the decades. The monastery continued, as it had for centuries, as it would for centuries more if God or fortune permitted. The brothers rose from matins in darkness, sang their psalms, did their work, lived their narrow lives of devotion and doubt. The walls stood solid against the chaos of the world, offering shelter to those who needed it, preserving in ritual and routine something valuable even if that value could not be easily named or measured. This was not the triumphant church of miracles and conversions, not the heroic faith of martyrs and saints. This was just the patient endurance of ordinary humans trying to live intentionally, trying to mean something, trying to persist with dignity through lives that offered no easy answers and promised no certain rewards. Brother Thomas grew old in his work, his hands finally too weak and eyes too dim to copy manuscripts. He was given simpler tasks, tending the garden, helping in the kitchen, sitting in the sun on good days, and remembering his life. He had no great insights to offer about what it all meant, no wisdom to distill from his decades of seeking. But he had lived honestly, had not lied to himself or others about the emptiness he felt, had chosen to continue despite absence rather than because of presence. Perhaps that was faith, of a kind. Perhaps that was enough. When death came for him finally, on a gray autumn day when the leaves were falling and the air smelled of smoke and earth, Brother Thomas accepted it without fear or hope. He had lived the life he had chosen, had spent his years in service to something larger than himself, even if he never knew exactly what that something was. The brothers gathered around his bed and sang the prayers for the dying, their voices rising and falling in the ancient rhythms. Thomas listened without understanding, the Latin words no longer translating into meaning, becoming simply sound, music, the acoustic texture of a life spent in prayer and doubt. His last thought, as consciousness faded, was neither of God nor heaven nor the salvation he had spent so many years uncertain of. He thought, instead of the garden in spring, of green things pushing through dark earth toward light, of the stubborn persistence of life in the face of death and darkness. That persistence, that continuing despite everything. Perhaps that was the only miracle available to humans, and perhaps it was enough. And so we leave the monastery, stepping back through time's veil into our own age. Behind us in the mists of history, the brothers continue their ancient rhythms, rising in darkness for prayer, laboring in silence, wrestling with doubt, persisting despite absence. Their lives were lived in the shadows of faith, in the gray places between certainty and despair, And perhaps their honesty about that struggle is their greatest gift to us across the centuries. If this journey through the medieval world has brought you peace, if these whispers from the past have offered you companionship on your own path through darkness, then please consider subscribing to Dark Medieval Whispers from the Past. Like this video to let us know we've touched something in you. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. We love hearing from fellow travelers through history's shadows. And most of all, be gentle with yourself as you navigate your own doubts and questions, your own wrestlings with meaning and absence. The monks would tell you, if they could, the struggle itself is prayer, the continuing is faith, and the honesty is what makes us human. Thank you for walking this path with us tonight. Until we meet again in the shadows of the past, may you find whatever peace is available to you. Good night.